three close friends share a common interest in railroads in general, and the Transcontinental Railroad in particular. Chuck Sweet is a recognized expert in the building and history of the Transcontinental Railroad and has been featured in several television specials and books. Chuck served as our guide and provides the narration for this presentation. Ron Udy is a retired school teacher and administrator. He has built an impressive 400-square-foot HO scale model railroad and is active in the Hostlers Model Railroad Club. Darrell Stage. A computer technician, I've been an armchair model railroader all my life and enjoy virtual scale railroading on my computer. Ron approached me last winter and asked if it were possible to drive the old Central Pacific grade from Lucin to Promontory. I said I didn't know, but Chuck would. We all met and made preliminary plans to make the trip the summer of 2010. Although Ron and I had no idea what we were in for, Chuck has visited the historic sites a dozen times through the years. At Chuck's suggestion, we rented a four-wheel drive vehicle and set out on a 700-mile, two-day journey into history.
Beginning our journey on our trip to Nevada, Shafter, and the Transcontinental Railroad grade from Lucin to Promontory and Moore to Cobre. This is an overview map of the itinerary that we're going. You'll see down at the bottom of the map, Wendover heading northwest. We're going to be dropping down from Interstate 80 into the little town of Shafter, 9 miles to the south from the interstate. This is where the Western Pacific Railroad and the Nevada Northern intersected, and there was a town there till 1957. This is an overview of the typical country that we'll be going through, showing distant mountains, the Southern Pacific grade, and the central right there, just showing you the juxtaposition of the two grades, showing the typical sagebrush steppe country between the mountain ranges, showing rabbitbrush and sagebrush. We're now at the site of Shafter, looking right down at the main line of the Nevada Northern Railroad. This ran from Cobre to the north, south to the copper mining town of Ely, about 120 miles. The main line has been abandoned since 1983, and you can show how the rails have been disconnected as it approaches the Western Pacific grade with the propane tanks in the background. This is a close-up of the main line of the Nevada Northern Railroad, which was completed around 1906 and abandoned around 1982, showing the remains of the ballast and the 60-pound steel rail, which was laid in the years 1905 to 1906. Once again showing the disconnect between the main line and the WP. This is an overview of the country showing how the rabbitbrush and sagebrush is beginning to take over the main line, which has been abandoned for over 2 decades. Here's two of our party looking closely at the disconnect, showing the ties and the 60-pound rail. Just a feature shot looking along the ball of the rail and the remains of the ballast. Once again, this was 60-pound steel rail rolled at Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. The brand is CF&I Company, Section 603, March of 06. This is a comparison between the 60-pound rail to the right and some heavier 70-pound rail to the left, which was laid in the Shafter area in the marshalling yards in 1948. Remains of a gondola car tipped on its side. You can see clearly, slightly to the right of center, the pivot point where the bolster pin went up into the car with the truck attached below. This is a remain of one of the trucks from that gondola car. This is modern equipment, a 44-tonner with a caboose. There seems to be some indication that they're going to revitalize the main line and put it back into use. These were laying in the marshalling yard at Shafter. This is the refurbished main line looking south towards Ely, showing how they put new ties and new ballast down. This is me looking closely at the new ballast which they've laid in refurbishing the line. Once again, you're looking south towards Ely. We're proceeding from Shafter to our original itinerary of going between Moore on the interstate just outside of Wells. going eastward towards the town of Cobre, which was the northern terminus of the Nevada Northern Railroad. We're on the grade of the Central Pacific, a few miles east of the town of Moore, where the Central Pacific grade intersects with the interstate. This is showing the parallel grades between the Union Pacific Railroad and the Central Pacific Railroad. We are on the Central Pacific Railroad, looking over slightly to the right at the original grade of the Union Pacific, which was graded parallel to the Central Pacific but never completed. This is just another overview of the fill on the Union Pacific grade. Trestles were never built across this gully. This is looking closer at the Central Pacific grade, just showing the lay of the land. We're fairly high in altitude here, showing the sagebrush, rabbitbrush with the juniper trees that were characteristic of the sagebrush juniper life zone. Just another curve in the Central Pacific grade proceeding east. This is another view of the Union Pacific parallel grade showing two abutments across the gully with the trestle never being built. We're proceeding east, and this is a town at Independent Springs, just showing a corral and remains of a log building. There's a spring here, and there's corrals for watering livestock. This is showing some of the remains at Independent Springs of former railroad structures. This is the remains of a concrete foundation. Another view of the concrete foundation of a bridge across the wash there at Independent Springs. This is a cut to the east of Independent Springs. We are approaching the cut. This section of the railroad was not followed by the road we were beyond, so we decided to stop and walk along the grade and see what it looked like. There is a couple of our party just looking more closely at the grade itself. You can see how in over 100 years the plants, sagebrush, rabbitbrush, have started to take over and almost obliterate any sign of the grade. This is a closer look at a cut in that original grade. This grade was abandoned around 1901 to 1908 when the Southern Pacific was rerouted, taking curvature out of the original route and straightening and using a more extensive fill work to make a more straight route. You can see how the sagebrush has completely taken over the bottom of the cut. This is a general overview of one of the overgrown cuts. It's been abandoned for over 100 years. You can see the two figures in the cut kind of giving the scale of how deep the cut was. This is the remains of a trestle, just showing the vertical bents remains. All of the top sails and the decking have long since disappeared. This is over 100 years of weathering and just decay of the trestle. This is the stump of a telegraph pole. They were 8 inches by 8 inches, square timbers, and this is one of the communication lines along the Central Pacific grade. This is Pequot Springs, a surprisingly large spring for the area. You can see the fairly extensive pond associated with the spring. This was somewhat of a surprise to us that the spring would be of such great size. This is looking further east, approaching the site of a train wreck that occurred during World War II on the Southern Pacific Main Line. This is the Southern Pacific Main Line and the lay of the land that you can see how much more extensive the trackage was. You can see the signal mast there in the foreground for the modern block system of train control. This is looking down at the Central Pacific grade, slightly left of center. You can see a cut in the middle of the fill where there once was a trestle. You can see even at this early stage how much fill work was needed to be done to get through this somewhat mountainous country. We're approaching the Pequot mountain range, and the country is becoming more broken and more heavily vegetated as we gradually rise in altitude. This is a closer view of the fill on the Central Pacific, showing the cut where the trestle was originally. This is looking back east, showing the Southern Pacific grade to the right and the Central Pacific grade slightly left of center. This is a closer look at the World War II era train wreck, showing the remains of car bodies that they just pushed over the side and left there after salvaging what they could use. Closer view of one of the car bodies sitting down in the brush. In the foreground you can see one of the ties that they took out in repairing the wreck site. This is a closer view of the Southern Pacific Main Line, showing the heavy cut work that they did in modern times to get the more modern road bed constructed. This is the remains of a car spring, part of the consist of that train wreck still existing in the site. We're continuing east. This is showing just a straight tangent on the original grade. You'll notice how all the juniper trees have grown up to a good height in over a century of growth in the cut since the line was abandoned at the turn of the last century. This is an overview of the grade proceeding east. We're on a road paralleling the Central and Southern Pacific grade. If you look at the center of the screen, you'll see a lower fill. That is the Central Pacific grade remains. If you look further to the right, you'll see a much larger fill, and that is the Southern Pacific grade. This is an overview of the Promontory branch. We're proceeding out of the segment of the original grade from Moore to Cobrae, and we're going to be going to Lucerne, and then proceeding along the Promontory branch towards Promontory itself. As you can see, we're taking a northeasterly tangent, and we're going to be going over the top of the Great Salt Lake and descending down into the Promontory Peninsula. This is approaching from the highway. We're heading south towards Lucerne, about 8 miles. This apparently is an old mill site that I'm going to be doing some research on to find out exactly what purpose it was there for. This is showing where the Southern Pacific grade and the old grade converge and meet. We're going to be taking off on the old grade and diverging from the Southern Pacific line here. This is an interpretive sign. We're going on the BLM, or Bureau of Land Management, Scenic Byway. They've done an excellent job of putting signage at each one of the railroad sites, giving a synopsis of the history of each site. We will be reading a lot of these signs and close up as we proceed along. This is starting out on the grade itself. You can see that the BLM has done an excellent job of keeping the grade smooth and well maintained. This line is 90 miles long, clear into Promontory. This is the first site, historic Lucerne. This is the first town east from the Umbria Junction, where the SP and the CP merged together. This is an overview of the town site of Lucerne. This is just another view of the debris field of Lucerne, looking over the town site. Just an overview of the country, fairly flat with our vehicle sitting up on top of the grade. Another view of the debris field at Lucerne. There were two sites. One was the old Lucerne. The new Lucerne was moved over on the SP when the promontory branch was essentially gated to a secondary branch line when the Lucerne cutoff was built in 1904-1905 across the Great Salt Lake. So they moved new Lucerne over on the SP where the Lucerne cutoff line comes and meets with the old promontory branch. This is one of the first trestles we're coming to. You notice that the approaches are all washed out, so there's what's called a shoe fly diverging from the trestle sharply to the right, going around the trestle and coming back to the grade beyond the trestle. This is the grade just proceeding eastward along the grade. Then one of the interesting small culverts that was put in, this is called a box culvert with wing walls, carefully preserved by the BLM. They may do maintenance on these to keep them from falling apart and preserving them. This is a general panorama of the Medea site, and you can see the country is fairly flat with distant mountains. This is what's called a double box culvert, well preserved, showing the timber construction they often use for small streams. This is a small trestle with two bents, showing a well preserved timber sails and cross timbers and remains of the ties showing the road bed. We'll be seeing many of these small trestles as we proceed eastward towards Terrace. This is called a rail rest. They would often put lengths of rail up out of the soil to keep them from deteriorating. You can see that the timber supports were cut at a slight angle so the rail would tip back towards the back and prevent it from falling off of the rail rest. This is an overview of the same rail rest, showing the two ends of the rest for the rails. Another small trestle with a single bent with the two end walls showing. Another small trestle with just a single span with the wing walls well preserved. These wing walls were used to prevent erosion and undercutting of the approaches to the trestle. This is a bovine site, just showing an overview. Once again, you can see the country hasn't changed appreciably. Barren, fairly flat, but distant mountain ranges. Another small trestle, just showing a single span. What's interesting about this is the dry-laid rock walls being used as wing walls to prevent erosion and undercutting of the culvert. A more distant view of another culvert showing the same construction with the dry-laid rock walls on either side, with most of the decking gone and just the long stringers being still extant on this culvert. This is another view of another culvert showing timber wing walls approaching the culvert. This is a very rare and unusual culvert. It's called a stave culvert. You can see that it's a barrel stave with an outflow floor and well-preserved wing walls on either side. This is another view of the other side of the culvert, showing the outflow and the two wing walls on either side of the round stave culvert. This is a close-up view showing the construction, just showing how well they cut the staves to make the round opening. Very well made. This is a typical of the gullies which are crossing the grade. That's why so many culverts and trestles were needed. We're crossing at right angles to the outflow from the mountainside. So many of these gullies had to have culverts and trestles to get the railroad across the water courses. This is another single box culvert showing the outflow floor and remains of the wing walls on either side. You can notice over to the left a dry laid rock wall that they were using to prevent erosion from occurring. Another small box culvert, very simple, simply the box with no wing walls or outflow floor on the bottom. This is an excellent example of the simple culvert with the dry laid rock walls on either side. You'll notice on this small culvert that there's a horizontal timber indicated by the arrow. This was put in to keep the rock walls from bowing in and caving into the watercourse. Another view of a rock culvert showing one of the timbers used as a brace between the rock walls on the inside. Just an overview of the lay of the land. We're going from Bovine heading east. You'll notice the terraces and the distant mountain range. This is the Terrace Mountains and shows that we're approaching a major railroad town on the promontory branch called, appropriately, Terrace. This is showing some anti-erosion work done by the Central and Southern Pacific Railroads. They would often take debris from their shops, such as old fire bricks, scrap metal, and cinders, and they would put it on the sides of the grade to keep it from eroding. This is Walden siding showing an overview of the site, showing a bit more vegetation on the flat ground than we've seen in the previous sites. Another view of one of the remaining ties from the 1940s abandonment of the Promontory branch. This is one of the larger trestles. You can see that it's got a bent in the middle and most of the decking is still well preserved. You can see the timber wing walls on either end of the trestle, preventing erosion and undercutting of the approach to the trestle. This is a watercress site. This was one of the later sites. This is about 6 miles from the major town of Terrace. This is where the water line came in for the water tank and also to supply water for the town of Terrace. This is the foundations where the water tank was, where they watered the steam engines, and just of course the footings and foundations is all that remains. This is one of the larger trestles approaching Terrace. You can see that there's 3 bents supporting the decking from one end to the other. Fairly high fill approaching this particular trestle. One of the smaller trestles showing vertical timbering on either side to prevent erosion from undercutting the trestle. This is our members of our party on one of the few trestles that you can drive across. We'll be going right across this trestle and approaching Terrace. This is showing timber wing walls on the trestle we just described, showing how they use railroad ties vertically, and you just used a stringer to tie them all together to prevent erosion of the approaches of the trestle. This is our vehicle on top of that trestle that you could still drive across, showing that it was still deemed safe by the BLM to use in this manner. This is an overview of the facilities at Terrace. Terrace at one time had as many as 3,000 people. The administrative shops, the roundhouse, the machine shops were all here because this was a division point up until the loose end cutoff was constructed, and this was moved east to Carlin. And after that, the town slowly died and was finally abandoned once the Promontory branch was torn up. This is one of the interpretive signs on the Terrace site. You can see the terrace of the Terrace Mountains in the background. This is the approach to where the administrative building was at Terrace. The debris field of loose bricks there shows where the building was at one time. This is some of the service pits of the roundhouse. They had an extensive roundhouse, and these are the remains of the pits. You can see that they're parallel, roughly in a radial pattern from the central pivot where the turntable was. This is the base of the turntable. If you look closely at the center of the photograph, you can see 4 large anchor bolts sticking up out of the concrete foundation. This is for the pivot where the roundhouse turntable was. You can see the circular depression where the turntable was at one time. This is another view of the circular depression where the turntable was. The roundhouse was around the edge of that. You can see by the figure in the foreground the scale of the site. This is the map showing the approach to Promontory. We'll be going and looking at various features on this site next. This is approaching Promontory from the southeast, showing the Big Fill, one of the last major fills constructed by the railroads in approaching Promontory. They worked on this fill for several weeks. It was one of the largest fills, ironically, in the whole Promontory branch. This is the concrete monument that they put in 1917 at the Golden Spike site. It was erected around 1917. It's been moved over adjacent to the Visitor Center from its original position right next to the Golden Spike site. There is the monument itself, put in the courtyard of the Visitor Center. It's been completely stabilized and refurbished. This is the interpretive sign at the rail exhibit of one of the last surviving entire lengths of pear-shaped iron rail used by the Central Pacific in constructing the rail site. This is a showing the comparison between the size of the original pear-shaped rounded shape of the original rail and modern 130-pound rail on the right. This we're approaching out of Promontory, going back east towards the last cut that was constructed by the railroads approaching Promontory. This is the last cut site itself, showing the remains of the cut. This was a cut made by the Union Pacific Railroad. You can see a pile of debris that they threw up out of the cut, well away from the side of the cut so it wouldn't fall back in. This is a closer view of the debris piles which were used to store the excavated material away from the edge of the cut. This is another view of those debris piles still sitting there after well over 100 years, much as they were when they left them. This is the approaches to a trestle site that were going to be used by the Union Pacific Railroad. It was never completed because the railroad was completed at the National Spike Historic Site in 1869. This trestle was never built because it wasn't needed. Here's a close-up of the stone culvert at the bottom of that site on the previous photograph, showing the stone culvert that they installed for the watercourse. This is another view of the parallel grade. We're on the Central Pacific grade in the extreme foreground, but you can see the Union Pacific grade in the background. That tan-shaped long structure is the Union Pacific grade. We're now looking from that site, looking back east around the shoulder of the mountain. To the right you can see the Central Pacific grade, and to the left at the center you can see the rock cut made by the Union Pacific Railroad. We're back on the Central Pacific grade, going around the shoulder of the mountain. In the background to the right, distant, is the salt flats and the approach to the Great Salt Lake. One of the cuts on the Central Pacific grade showing the rock work that they had to do rounding the shoulder of the mountain. This is a distant view of once again of the parallel grades. The Central Pacific is to the left and the Union Pacific is to the right, showing the rock cut side by side. This is one of the commemorative signs. This is a replica. The original is in the Visitor Center, and the other original, 10 miles away, is in the Daughters of Utah Pioneers Museum in Salt Lake City. A bet was made whether the Central Pacific could lay 10 miles in one day. The Central Pacific made sure that there was less than 10 miles that could be completed on the Union Pacific before they made their bet. So they marshaled all of their materials and support crews, got a crew of 8 Irishmen, and proceeded to lay 10 miles in one day, winning the bet. By the way, Durant and the Union Pacific never paid their bet.
As we conclude our trip, what a wonderful experience it was to travel along the same route these early men and women traveled in building the Transcontinental Railroad. To actually visualize what we have heard and read about is something everyone should experience. We were somewhat able to imagine what it must have been like to work and live in such desolate, hot, and dusty conditions. The physical and back-breaking work is almost beyond comprehension. A main railroad grade is kept at about 2%. In order to accomplish this, imagine the workers cutting through the earth, by shovel and horse-drawn scraper, and hauling the debris away in small horse-drawn carts, or filling in depressions with earth, all done by hand, no machines or modern conveniences.